The grand courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a quiet hum that only served to heighten the tension hanging in the air. The case had already garnered attention for all the wrong reasons, an affluent socialite facing charges for reckless driving and destruction of property. But for Cassandra Monroe, it seemed like just another day to strut around and flex her privilege. She walked into the courtroom with all the grace and arrogance that money could buy. Her red designer gown flowed behind her like a cape, each step a calculated motion to remind everyone in the room of who she was. A spoiled socialite, used to getting everything she wanted, Cassandra moved through the courtroom with the certainty that her family's wealth would make everything disappear, just as it always had. At the judge's bench, the Honorable Judge James Carter sat, his expression calm but unwavering. Judge Carter was no stranger to the disparities in the legal system. A black man who had fought for decades to ensure justice and equality, he had seen more than his fair share of privileged defendants looking down on those they deemed inferior. He knew exactly what was happening here, and he wasn't about to let Cassandra Monroe's attitude slide. Cassandra barely spared him a glance as she approached the stand. She flashed a bright, practiced smile, but it was clear that she wasn't here for justice. She was here to be let off the hook. "Let's just get this over with," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with entitlement. "My daddy's lawyer is waiting, and I don't have time for this." Her words hung in the air, challenging the very foundation of the courtroom. She didn't see a judge. She saw an obstacle to her day. A man doing his job was beneath her. In her mind, the rules didn't apply to her. She could buy her way out of anything. The idea that she might actually face consequences was laughable to her. Judge Carter narrowed his eyes. He had seen this kind of attitude countless times before. People like Cassandra Monroe believed that money and status made them untouchable. But Judge Carter had a deep, unshakable belief in fairness. And today, he was about to teach her that no amount of wealth could protect her from accountability. "Ms. Monroe," he said, his voice calm but firm, "your actions have consequences, and they will be met with the full extent of the law. Your privilege may have shielded you from the real world, but here, in my courtroom, everyone is equal." Cassandra rolled her eyes, but said nothing. She leaned back in her chair, completely dismissing his words as if they were meaningless. Judge Carter wasn't fazed. He'd dealt with people like her before. People who thought the rules didn't apply to them. He had spent his career fighting to give the marginalized voices in this country a chance to be heard, while the rich continued to buy their way out of trouble. Today, he was going to make sure that Cassandra Monroe faced the same consequences that anyone else would. His words carried weight. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The whispers among the spectators grew louder as they realized what was happening. Judge Carter wasn't going to let this privileged young woman walk out without facing the truth. The law, for all its flaws, was the law for a reason. As Cassandra sat there, half smiling and uninterested, she didn't realize that her world was about to come crashing down. Judge Carter wasn't just a man of the law. He was a man of conviction. And in that moment, Cassandra Monroe would learn that no amount of wealth or power could shield her from the truth. The law would hold her accountable no matter how far her family's money could reach. The room held its breath, waiting for the next move. This was more than just a courtroom case. It was a battle of justice, dignity, and fairness. The fight for accountability had just begun. Where are you watching from, and what time is it? Tell us your thoughts. The courtroom was filled with tension, as the judge began to read the charges against Cassandra Monroe. Miss Monroe, you are accused of reckless driving, endangering lives, and causing over $200,000 in damages. How do you plead? Cassandra chuckled lightly, leaning back in her seat with a smug expression. Oh, please, this is ridiculous. Do you know who my father is? She said with a wave of her hand. The audience shifted, murmuring among themselves. Even her lawyer looked uncomfortable at her casual dismissal of the gravity of the situation. I don't belong here, Cassandra continued, her tone laced with arrogance. This is a waste of everyone's time. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Cassandra turned her gaze toward Judge Carter, the man who had been assigned to her case, her voice oozing with condescension. No offense, Judge. Carter, was it? But people like you wouldn't understand my world, she added, her eyes scanning the courtroom with disdain. Judge Carter's face remained unreadable. He leaned back in his chair, his hands steepled in front of him. The room fell silent as everyone waited for his response. And what world is that, Miss Monroe? The judge asked, his voice calm but firm. A world where the law doesn't apply to people like me. Cassandra smirked, her arrogance unwavering. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't just her words that caused the stir, but the sheer entitlement in her tone. The audacity of someone who believed they could disregard the law simply because of their status. Even the bailiff shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable with her attitude. The rest of the courtroom, filled with the quiet murmurs of spectators, all seemed to share the same sentiment. Cassandra was not just underestimating the seriousness of the charges against her. She was underestimating the people in this room. Judge Carter, however, didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering as he stared down at Cassandra. There was no sign of amusement or irritation on his face, only the quiet confidence of a man who had seen arrogance before and knew how to handle it. Miss Monroe, the judge finally spoke, his voice low but powerful. You might have come into this courtroom thinking you could dictate the terms, but here, you are not above the law. You may think that your last name and your father's wealth shield you from the consequences of your actions, but you are wrong. This court will see to it that justice is served, just as it would for anyone else. Cassandra's smirk faltered for a split second. For the first time, she could see that Judge Carter was not intimidated. He wasn't swayed by her name, her wealth, or her arrogance. You may believe that this is just an inconvenience to you, but there are lives at stake here. Reckless driving doesn't just cause damage to property. It destroys lives. The law is not a game, and it is not a privilege. It is a responsibility. Her eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond, her smugness replaced with a hint of uncertainty. The courtroom sat in an eerie silence, waiting for her next move. But Cassandra had made a critical mistake. She underestimated the people in this room, especially the judge who now had the power to decide her fate. The lesson had only just begun. Have you ever seen someone underestimate the wrong person? Drop your thoughts below. The courtroom fell into a tense silence as the prosecutor stepped forward, adjusting the papers in their hands. Your Honor, the prosecutor said, turning to Judge Carter, we have footage that clearly shows Miss Monroe's reckless behavior that night. The screen flickered to life, and the dim light of the courtroom made the images sharp and vivid. The footage displayed Cassandra Monroe's car speeding down the street, weaving dangerously between traffic. Pedestrians jumped out of the way, startled by the reckless driving. The car swerved, narrowly avoiding a group of children walking home from school. A loud crash echoed from the video as Cassandra's car slammed into the front of a bakery. Windows shattered, and the storefront collapsed under the force. Gasps rose from the audience as they watched the footage unfold. The scene was jarring, a display of careless violence, and yet Cassandra appeared to have no reaction. She was laughing as the camera zoomed in on her, her champagne glass still in hand, carefree and unbothered. This is the moment that captures the essence of her disregard for life and property, the prosecutor said. While people were in danger, Miss Monroe was drinking champagne in the driver's seat. The audience murmured again, shocked by the evidence. Some shook their heads, others exchanged quiet words with one another, all clearly stunned by Cassandra's indifference. Judge Carter, ever composed, didn't break his gaze from the screen. His eyes were calculating as the footage continued. Once the video stopped, he turned to face Cassandra, his voice unwavering. "Miss Monroe, do you still find this situation ridiculous, as you stated earlier?" he asked. Cassandra, unfazed, crossed her arms defiantly. The smirk on her face only seemed to grow. "Please," she responded, dismissing the entire thing with a wave of her hand. "My father will handle this. Just find me and let me go. This is such a waste of time." The judge didn't flinch, his expression unchanging. He motioned to the prosecutor to continue. The room, however, was no longer silent. Whispers and hushed conversations filled the space, people clearly appalled by Cassandra's behavior. "Do you feel any remorse for your actions, Miss Monroe?" Judge Carter's voice was measured, but firm. At this, Cassandra laughed. The sound was light, dismissive. "For what?" she said, her tone dripping with arrogance. "A few broken windows. I'll just buy them a new store. Who cares?" The words hung in the air, sharp and cold. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Judge Carter's gaze didn't waver. He studied Cassandra with an unreadable expression, but it was clear his patience was thinning. The prosecutor stepped back, giving the judge room to respond. The courtroom was silent, waiting for the judgment, waiting to see how Judge Carter would handle someone so brazen in the face of such undeniable evidence. Judge Carter sighed, rubbing his temples as he sat back in his chair. The courtroom was silent, everyone waiting for him to speak. "Miss Monroe, do you know what the law says about reckless endangerment?" he asked, his tone calm but stern. Cassandra Monroe, sitting confidently in her designer clothes, shrugged, her face adorned with a smug expression. "Something about community service? I'll send my assistant," she said, dismissing the question with a flip of her hand. Judge Carter's eyes narrowed slightly, a small smile crossing his face. "Actually, no. Given the severity of your actions, you're facing potential jail time." Cassandra's smirk faltered, her eyes widening slightly as she leaned forward. "Excuse me?" Judge Carter leaned forward, his voice unwavering but firm. "You think money can buy you out of consequences. You think your father's name makes you immune to the law. But in this courtroom, justice is blind." He picked up a letter from his desk, holding it up for all to see. Cassandra's eyes followed the movement, her face suddenly paling. The letter was a statement from her father's attorney. He had refused to intervene in her case. "This is a statement from your father's attorney," Judge Carter said, pausing for dramatic effect. "He has refused to intervene in your case." Cassandra's eyes widened in disbelief. Her father, the powerful businessman she always relied on to get her out of trouble, wasn't bailing her out this time. "It seems," Judge Carter continued, "your father believes it's time you learn what real consequences look like." The weight of his words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Cassandra's hands gripped the arms of her chair as the realization sank in. Judge Carter slammed the gavel down, the sound echoing throughout the courtroom. "I sentence you to 6 months in county jail, followed by 1,000 hours of community service. Maybe then you'll understand the value of accountability." The courtroom gasped in unison. Cassandra's world, built on privilege and entitlement, crumbled in an instant. She opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat. "No, you can't do this." "My father," she started, but her voice trembled, and she was cut off by the cold stare of Judge Carter. But no one was listening. The officers moved toward her, ready to escort her out of the courtroom. They didn't need to say anything. Their silence spoke volumes. Cassandra's body stiffened, her face turning red with humiliation and rage. She stood up, her legs unsteady, as she was led away. The weight of her actions had finally caught up with her, and for once, there was no one to save her. The courtroom returned to its eerie silence, the truth of accountability lingering in the air. The world had finally caught up with Cassandra Monroe. Do you think Cassandra deserved her sentence? Let us know. As Cassandra is led away, the once arrogant girl is now silent. Her world of privilege has just collapsed in front of everyone. The courtroom buzzes with the murmurs of the audience, but Cassandra doesn't hear any of it. She's too caught up in her own thoughts. The confidence that once defined her is gone, replaced by the weight of the reality she must now face. Judge Carter watches her go, shaking his head. He's seen people like her before. People who believed their money could shield them from the consequences of their actions. But maybe, just maybe, this time the lesson will stick. He hopes so, for her sake. But he knows there's no guarantee. Justice may be blind, but even the blind have to learn to see the truth. A year passes, and life moves on. In the quiet of the courtroom, the case against Cassandra is now a distant memory. But for her, the memory of that day is still fresh. She stands in a community center, wearing a simple shirt and jeans. Gone are the designer clothes, the expensive accessories, the attitude that screamed entitlement. The arrogance is gone, replaced by a humility she never thought she'd need. She's here because her sentence forced her to confront the very people she once looked down on. People whose lives weren't defined by wealth, whose value wasn't measured in bank accounts or designer brands. And slowly, over time, she's come to understand that money isn't everything. Her days are filled with helping those she once thought were beneath her, offering assistance in ways she never would have considered a year ago. She sees the families struggling to make ends meet, the children who won't get the same opportunities she once took for granted, and the elderly who have nowhere to turn. It's not an easy job, but it's real and it's meaningful. One afternoon, as she's wiping down a table, she looks up and sees Judge Carter walking past the community center. Their eyes meet. Her heart skips a beat. The judge's stern demeanor remains unchanged, but there's something different now. Instead of the arrogance she once saw in herself, Cassandra nods, not with pride, but with respect. Judge Carter stops for a moment, his gaze softening. He knows that look. He's seen it before. The transformation of someone who has finally come to understand that justice isn't just about punishment. It's about the capacity for change, for redemption. "I told you, justice is blind," he says, his voice calm. His small smile doesn't reach his eyes, but it's enough to let Cassandra know that he sees her differently now. Cassandra nods again, her expression sincere. She doesn't have all the answers, and she's not perfect. But she's learned that humility doesn't come from being knocked down. It comes from getting back up, from understanding that the people around you matter as much as you do. And for the first time in a long time, she feels like she belongs. As Judge Carter walks away, Cassandra watches him go. She doesn't know if she'll ever be able to undo all the harm she caused, but for the first time she knows she's on the right path. A story of arrogance, downfall, and redemption, of one woman learning that true change comes not from wealth, but from understanding the value of people over possessions. Do you believe Cassandra truly changed? Or will she go back to her old ways? Let's discuss